Hey guys, today we're talking about player positioning, substitutions, and rotations at the 7v7 youth soccer level. So let's go. This is a question I get quite a bit, and it has to do with how do I put players in certain positions at this age group. You might be taking over a new team, this might be brand new to you, and of all the things you're trying to figure out with your players is how do I position certain people in certain spots? And then when we get into games, how do you go through substitutions and rotations in relationship to those positions?
So this is my preferred formation at 7v7, which most of you know as the 2-3-1. So you have two center backs, three midfielders, two who are outside midfielders or fullbacks, and you have one central midfielder and a striker up top.
So this is definitely where I wanted to start because by far, the biggest mistake I see coaches make, especially younger, newer coaches, is putting weaker players in your center back spots. You have to put two of your stronger players in these roles. And the reason for that is if you don't do that, you're gonna have a very difficult time building out of the back, which for me is a foundation for what we're trying to do. So your center backs have to be comfortable on the ball and they have to be good distributors. Ideally, they'd be good defenders as well. Sometimes that's not always the case, but they have to be good with the ball and they have to be able to distribute so you can do what you want to do when in possession.
So your fullbacks again are the number 2 and the number 3, and they play out wide. And this is really where I like to put kids with speed and kids who are good with what we call running with the ball. So they don't necessarily have to be fantastic technical players. They don't necessarily have to be great just dribbling in tight spaces. But these kids do need to be very comfortable taking the ball up and down the field, because the way that I play, the fullbacks or the outside midfielders are asked to track up and down, up and down. So they need to be good athletes, they need to be fast, but again, these don't have to be your most technical players. Even if these are just kids who are really aggressive or like to run, that can really be helpful.
The other thing that's helpful in a fullback is someone who can get crosses into the box. Now at the younger ages, this is harder, but if you have, let's say, a strong left-footed player, I would recommend you put them on the left fullback spot for crossing the ball in. Same thing with a strong right-footed player, you play them on the right wing. And these are the players who also take our corners when I do corner kicks. Now, if you know anything about how I do corners, I do start out at short corners, but when we actually do play a corner into the 18-yard box, it's the fullbacks who actually take the kick. And I do that for simplicity, but again, this is something to consider when placing players into that role.
All right, on to our center midfielder. And the center midfielder here is, to me, your most technical player. So this has got to be somebody who's good in tight spaces, who is good with the ball on their feet. This is actually where I would typically play either my most dynamic player or one of my more dynamic players. And the caveat with that, however, is that this is a player who's got to be good positionally. So those two things don't always come together, where you have a player who's very good technically, who's dynamic, and who's also good positionally, because you can see as the ball comes to one side, you got to be careful not to have a center midfielder who's going to come too far over. And this is partly coaching and partly development of the player. But as the ball goes in different spots, we can't have a person in the 6 role who just follows the ball randomly. They've got to understand that they have to stay in the center of the pitch and move around just slightly to the left or to the right, depending on where the ball is. It's got to be somebody who both will have a very high work rate. It's someone who has to both attack and defend, and it has to be somebody who's very athletic and in good shape. So the 6 is definitely where I would be putting at least one of my better players, if not my best player, and they have to qualify under all those circumstances.
So most often I see coaches putting their best player in the striker role. And I'm not saying that that's a wrong thing to do. It just, when you look at the makeup of your team, you have to make a decision as to what's going to be best for my team. And sometimes it is putting your best player up top and trying to score a goal. But in other circumstances, if you're trying to build out of the back and trying to do things in possession, sometimes your best player really can't be that high up the field because they're never going to touch the ball. Players that I put in the striker position, they do need to be aggressive defenders, or at least be coached to be an aggressive defender, because the striker is the start of our press. When other teams build out of the back, when other teams are doing their goal kicks, the striker is the pressure. I always say, you're the pressure, not the nine's the pressure, and then the fullbacks would be cover, the center midfielder would be cover. So when you think about who to put in that striker role, I don't think it should just be about who can score goals. There's a lot of other things to consider. So I deliberately left the goalkeeper towards the end because for me at this age, it's not an incredibly important decision about who plays goal. Ideally, and what typically happens as you have the team for a while, is you have 2, maybe 3 kids who one expressed interest, but what you'll see is all of them will want to play goal. But 2 can actually play it. So what you need is the kid can't be scared of the ball. You'll a lot of times have players who volunteer to be goal and then they won't touch the ball with their hands at this age. So that's number 1. And number 2, they got to have a little bit of a thick skin. So what can happen sometimes is no matter how much of fault the goalkeeper is, anytime a goal is scored, especially at these younger ages, the whole team will blame the goalkeeper. And so it has to be a kid who's a little bit tough and a little bit resilient. But for the most part, I don't like to keep one particular goalkeeper at this age. I like to have a couple, maybe 2 or 3 on the team, rotate them through, because they still need a lot of development with their feet. And if you just keep them in goal, sometimes that doesn't happen.
So in summary, guys, your center backs have to be strong players. They have to be good on the ball, good distributors. Your fullbacks need to be athletic. They need to run with the ball. They don't necessarily have to be the most technical. They just need to be able to run up and down the field. Your center mid should be, if not your best player, one of your best players, very good positionally, very good technically. The striker, obviously we would like the striker to be able to score goals, but for me, they need to be an aggressive defender first. And lastly, the goalkeepers, guys, just needs to be somebody who's not afraid of the ball, will use their hands, and has a little bit of thick skin.
Okay, let's talk rotations and substitutions. So for me, guys, there are 3 rules to rotations and substitutions that I follow that I recommend you do the same. Rule number 1, never put your best 7 players out on the field at the same time, unless it's the end of the game and you really need to score a goal. The reason for this is you don't want to have all your best players on the field at once, and then when you bring in your subs, the level goes down dramatically. You will get burned, I'm telling you. Don't put your best 7 kids on the field at the same time. Rule number 2, when you have 2 weaker players, do not put them on the same side of the field. If you have a player who's playing your right fullback who is a little bit weaker, put a strong player as the right center back and put another weaker player on the left side of the field, either as maybe the left center back or the left wing. This again is just an attempt to try to spread out your players so you don't just have one side of the field that's dramatically better than the other. Rule number 3, when you can, try to strategically sub at the striker position and out wide at the fullback positions. As I've said before, for me, the center backs are the 2 most important positions, or at least you have to have 2 very strong players playing there, as well as your center midfielder. So what I'll do if I have 10 players is I might keep the center midfielder and the center backs in the game almost the whole game and do rotations where we just sub 3 for 3 between the striker and the 2 fullbacks. Now obviously we're going to be moving some players around and it doesn't always work exactly like that. And typically with my goalkeeper, they're only doing a half. So depending on where else they play on the field, that doesn't always work out 100%. But when you can, the places you want to sub are your striker and the wide areas with your fullbacks.
So here's a visual example of what I was talking about with my 10 players. What I would try to do is strategically sub the striker and the 2 fullbacks with my 3 players on the bench. And then eventually when one of my center backs or the center mid needed a break, we could rotate people in through. All right, so here's an example of having 12 players, which is another common number in a 7v7 team. So you can see I have 5 on the bench and 7 out here. And I don't typically sub the goalie out except for at halftime. So you're going to be making a decision on how to sub these 5 players into the 6 spots on the field. And what I would say is, one, you've got to mix the level and the strengths and weaknesses. You don't want to, again, have one rotation that's dramatically different. But if your 6 is particularly dynamic, I would either keep the 6 in and rotate 5 in, 5 out, or keep one of the center backs in and rotate 5 in and 5 out.
So thanks for checking out the video, guys. If you have comments, please put them below. And if you like this video, check out that one.